there's very little conflict. Prior to that, Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company would definitely fight over each other a little bit, and there could be clashes with those kind of things. But yeah, and it's worth noting that while the Hudson Bay Company is a English or British company, like you've got more people probably speaking French working for the company than you have English. If you went to Fort Edmonton, if you traveled back in time, you'd find maybe a quarter of the people there speak some bit of English, and some of them not the English that we think of because they're maybe speaking Gaelic or something like that, because they've got a bunch of Scottish people who are trained as boat builders because they were better boat builders. You've got a bunch of French people who, because the French have been doing for training for longer, so they've got more experience with that, and you've got a lot of Métis and Aboriginal people working for the company too, and so you'd have a lot of people speaking Cree around. In fact, even John Rowan, his daughters, when they learned to read and write, they didn't learn English reading and writing, they learned Cree syllabics, and their letters are not just written syllabically in Cree, but like actually Cree, like they're thinking and writing in Cree. So even for your upper class people during the fur trade often would be sort of immersed in that.
What do they eat?
Lots and lots of meat. Yeah, meat's like one of the biggest things that they would eat a lot of. It's worth noting things like sugar is crazy expensive and crazy difficult to have. So you wouldn't have very much of anything with sugar other than on really special occasions. Like there's stories of somebody getting a cup of sugar as part of a wedding gift, and things where it's like they're crazy expensive, and so they might make a sweet cake because it's somebody's wedding or something, but that's an extravagant gift. So lots of meat and potatoes. They did grow huge gardens around the fort, and potatoes were a huge part of that. Potatoes are easy to grow and they fill you up. Yeah, so a lot of that. So a lot of bison meat because there's tons of bison around. They did bring out a couple of cows that they thought they would use for making some butter and stuff, and then they just ate them. So that didn't last very long. But yeah, they do things like that. Yeah, lots of meat and potatoes. They could get flour brought out. They weren't necessarily making or able to grow flour. It wasn't really till the 1880s that they could really grow wheat out here. They tried and failed until in the 1880s they found a strain or created a strain of wheat really that could grow out here. But all the wheats from Europe just would die in the soils. So lots of meat and potatoes, and then certainly pemmican's a big thing where you dry the meat, mix it with berries and fat, and you pound that whole thing down, and it will last forever. In fact, they would bury it along river beds and put sticks up so that as people would be going on the York boats, as you go from place to place, you come across the next stash so you pull over, there's this stash, and you dig it up from the hole. And still today, people will find once in a while, because sometimes, the water came up and it just washed everything away. And so still today, people will once in a while along the kind of river valleys that lead to Hudson Bay will find these preserved bags of pemmican, which in theory you could eat. I wouldn't eat 300-year-old pemmican, but in theory you could. But yeah, so it's a good thing. And of course, bannock also, because bannock you could basically make with flour, add water, mix it together, cook it as sort of a biscuit to eat bread sort of thing. And bannock's an interesting one in that depending who you talk to is sort of where its origins come from. Most scholarship says it's a Scottish bread actually, and which Aboriginal people adopted because you have to think they didn't really have flour. And the word bannock comes actually from Scotland and things like that. So it was adopted by the Aboriginal people when they were able to start trading and be like, oh, we can get flour, oh, we can make bread, so this is fantastic. But it's something that there was versions of something like bannock in kind of the southern U.S. and throughout like Mexico and stuff, and they actually had a word that sounds very much like bannock. And so there are Aboriginal people who are like, no, we created this first. It's sort of a little contentious as to which, and it's sort of like, well, you take flour, you mix water with it. It's pretty easy. It probably came from multiple sources, but around here we're pretty certain that it's the Scottish influence that brought it out and gave it its name.
How did they cope with the climate?
Sometimes they didn't. They had to. You had to. Part of it is just living in pretty small quarters. Aside from John Rowan, who had like a big house, and you go to visit that. If you go to the men's quarters, you see these little cabin kind of spaces, and it would be like a little cabin would have often like 3 families, so man, wife. So that's already 6 people, plus each of those has around 8 kids, and like everybody in one little room. And you have a fire going and stuff, and that's part of how you keep warm. But certainly exposure to the elements and stuff was a concern and something that people would run into. Not so much a story of Fort Edmonton, but I worked also kind of up in northern Alberta, and the first. It's debated as whether it's the first fort in Alberta or not, but Fort Vermilion likes to claim that they're the first fort. There's another fort that tries to claim that title too, and the reason it's contentious is that Fort Vermilion built a fort in the 1700s. They built one there. That winter, everyone froze to death and died, and the fort burned down because they left their fires going. Then the next year, some more people came to Fort Vermilion. They found the rubble and the dead bodies. They buried them. They built a new fort, and then that winter, everyone froze and died. And it goes on for about like 7 or 8 years, where every winter, every single person froze and died, and the fires went and burned down the whole fort. And so in the midst of that, another fort somewhere else in like southern Alberta pops up. And so they're like, we're the first fort. And Fort Vermilion's like, no, we are. And it's like, well, we're the first fort that actually survived winter in Edmonton or in Alberta. So yeah, there's certainly cases within the fur trade where they didn't survive. And so you had to make sure that you had plenty of firewood, which is part of why that need to move the fort from time to time, because when it's minus 40, you don't want to have to like go walk several miles one way to go cut down some trees and then drag those several miles back. Like you're gonna freeze to death in the meantime. And they would burn down. If you filled up the entire fort, the courtyard with wood from like the bottom up to the top. That's about how much wood you would burn throughout the winter in the fort to keep things going. So yeah. That said, people were also like just incredibly tough, and they were working all of the time. And so you also kept warm by just moving and working all of the time. And you know, you're collecting furs and things like that. The beaver fur is actually one of the interesting things about them. Was the beaver furs were actually worth more when Aboriginal people trade them in if they had actually like skinned the beaver and then held onto the fur and kind of traveled with it for a year or two, because all those long guard hairs, the waxy ones that aren't going to be any good for the felt hat, they will have fallen out. And so you could, before you trade in your furs that you've caught, you might like use them, sew them into a coat or something like that, keep yourself warm over the winter and stuff. And over the winter, all those guard hairs fall off as you're kind of rubbing it around, and now your fur is actually worth more too as you trade it in. So
that makes sense.
So you could do things like that.
How did they pass the time?